to be back and excited to be talking about semifinals of the college football playoff. I know it's been a couple days since these games have happened, but I know on the show I've been pretty consistent with this in general. Actually, taking a couple days, letting things linger, letting things settle before I really kind of do the deep dive, because I really try on the show to not just kind of give the takes that every other person here is kind of taking or whatnot. I try to be original, try to be give a different perspective than what people would otherwise be thinking. And now that I've had a couple days to watch some of the highlights back and really think about the games in full circle, I'm excited to be breaking this down and everything. And I'd say first and foremost in terms of these playoffs, big shout out to Arizona State, particularly Cam Scatterboot, considering you had a rushing touchdown, a passing touchdown, and a receiving touchdown. Needless to say, definitely deserves to be the MVP. Deserves a ton of respect in that game, and you got to be excited about how this program is going too. And I've talked about this on the show before, but be able to go from the Herm Edwards and Antonio Pierce shit show to now being one of the most premier teams in the Big 12. The recruiting that you're going to have is probably night and day. And, now you can expand your footprint outside of the state of Arizona. You can target kids in Southern California and Texas and possibly in the Mountain West region. And when you have a guy like Kenny Dillingham, who has the experience as a coordinator at Oregon, one of the youngest in all of college football, Arizona State was smart enough to lock up these guys now. And, it seems like Dillingham's going to be in there at least for the time period. And there really is no reason for him to jump ship at all. I mean, I'm sure people are going to always say that, be like, oh, he's one of the up and coming coaches, whatever. But at the same time, like he has there's no reason for him to rush. I mean, you're built, if especially too, he's at the age and like you can build something special there. And when 10 years down the line, if you feel differently about it, you can always jump ship. But in any event, they're excited to be. They should be in a position to really be relevant for the next couple seasons too, especially with just how open the Big 12 is in general. I'm excited to see where that program takes them. A big shout out to them. But in terms of the other college football games in general, or just in terms of general takeaways from the games, let's say, I mean, there's a couple things that sort of come to mind in general. I'd say first and foremost, the structure of the college football playoff is definitely going to change. And viewers on the show before, I mean, I've been an advocate for either the BCS playoff format or even just the 14 playoff format. So I'm not necessarily going to get into, critiquing every little thing. I think the angle that I'm going to be a little bit more interested in taking here is more or less how the seeding goes in terms of the college football playoff, because all the teams who got buys essentially all lost. So you sit there and say to yourself, are they really getting an advantage having a bye? I would argue they still are, but at the same time, from a coaching perspective, you might sit there and say, well, you haven't played a college football game in 3 weeks. And if you're, let's say, asleep at the wheel coming to these games, maybe it's a little bit different. Or, maybe part of it too is just you have the momentum of those other games too. But I guess another angle you can take at this too is simply that the favorite team, the teams who are the favorites won. So maybe it's not that deep in terms of switching it all around, but I have to imagine that after these games, they are going to be experimenting with either some sort of reseeding format where, depending on who wins, they might do it that way. Because I think that's really the big question that the college football committee has to ask is one, do they want to keep the structure that they have in terms of reseeding, or the 4 conference champions getting the bye? I think that's really the first question that you ask. And I think the second question that you ask is, do the 4 teams that get a bye, does it have to be the conference champions? Because that's really the catch-22 that we're finding ourselves in. Because in the sense, I've always advocated for conference championships, and I always will in the show. So you can fight that with me, but I will defend that to the bone. But I think really what has to happen, or my general critique of it, would be have the conference champions still matter, but it just doesn't. They don't have to be in the top 4. So I think that's kind of the general takeaway after watching Georgia lose, Arizona State lose, Boise State lose, and now Oregon too. I think that's probably the common thread I would argue, is that yes, the conference championship should still matter, and yes, I think they should still be guaranteed a spot. And I would even argue that having a bye is okay, because I think in some way you have to be rewarded for being a top 4 team. I think in general that has to be in the formula somehow, in the sense of, okay, if you have a generally a better regular season win, then, you know, record, then you should be favored, or you should be getting some sort of incentive from doing that. Because I think the fear that I worry about is sort of what the NFL does, where by week 16, week 17, they're at the point where they bench their starters or they don't play all the top players or whatever. I think that's the struggle that you're finding yourself in, and you're sort of seeing that with the bowl games. I mean, it's a little bit different, but I have to tell you, dude, the bowl games have still been really exciting this year. I mean, I can think of just countless bowl games off the top of my head where it didn't matter if the third string quarterback from North Texas, who was a walk on, that kid threw for almost 400 yards, and the game was still really exciting to watch. And those kids who have been busting their ass who could be seniors at this point, to be able to get themselves this moment, have a little vacation and play some football. I'm not seeing what the problem is, especially when you have some of these big sponsors like Pop Tarts, like Cheez-Its. Even Snoop Dogg has his own damn bowl, for God's sake. So it's like you sit there and say to yourself, I mean, but again, I'm looking at this from a very traditional way, in the sense of bowl game. It's not like the NFL where you're playing. Like, of course, everybody wants to win a national championship, right? But not every team is sitting there every year being a national contender. There's nothing wrong with just saying, hey, winning a conference championship and winning a bowl game, there's nothing wrong with that being your goal, or having 8 wins or having 9 wins, whatever you want it to be. So I think for me, that this whole playoff formats too is reiterating the fact that bowl games still matter, but I think it's in a different way than kind of a traditional sense. In terms of traditional logic would just be, for probably people who don't even, for the younger viewers out there, just of, hey, you're not in the playoff, you don't matter. So I think that's kind of the catch-22 that you're finding yourself in. But I think more than ever now that it does matter, and I think you're seeing a ton of kids playing out there with a lot of heart, a lot of determination, and there's always going to be an element of players leaving, of coaches leaving, and I hate to see that too, like everybody else. But until the calendar gets realigned, and until the transfer portal has some sort of checks and balances, we're just going to continue to see that. And the tampering thing is always going to be happening too. But in terms of kind of now looking forward and saying to ourselves, well, some of the other takeaways, I mean, I look at this Notre Dame and Penn State matchup, and I'm very intrigued by this matchup, because in many ways it reminds me a lot of the Notre Dame and Georgia matchup, in the sense of two very strong defenses. I think Riley Leonard and Drew Allard both have their issues at times. I think Penn State's going to have the same sort of strategy against Notre Dame, in the sense of Georgia went into the game saying, okay, Riley Leonard, we're going to try to make you throw the ball and eliminate your ability to be able to run the ball. However, Riley Leonard was actually quite effective, and even when Jeremiah Love was out for an injury for a little bit, the running back by committee showed up, did their thing, and the defense was able to shut down Georgia, like I said they would in the prediction. I mean, they ran man coverage on the outside. They weren't able to get any sort of separation whatsoever, and they took care of business. And Marcus Freeman and Al Golden showed why they're two of the best defensive minds in all of college football, and that was on full display. And now you have Penn State coming into town. Man, I'm really intrigued by that matchup, and I think that one, more than anything, is going to be a toss up. It's something that you're looking forward to. And then shifting gears a little bit to Ohio State and Texas now, I'd say first and foremost, I mean, the big conversation with Texas is going to be about Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning. I think that's something that's going to be probably discussed. I know that there's other podcasts out there who will advocate for Quinn Ewers getting benched, or for this, that, or the other to happen. I personally think that's a little bit extreme. Do I think Quinn Ewers played great? No. But should he still be the starter? Absolutely. The reality is, when teams are giving you $60 million offers to transfer in the portal, you know he might be going in the draft, and he's been your leader all year, aside from the 2 games that he was injured. And yes, I get he's not the greatest passer in the world. He has enough athletic ability to maybe be a little bit of a threat, but nothing special. But Arch Manning is your guy in the future. And in this day and age of college football, if you know that your goal is to go to the NFL, which it is for a lot of these kids, you only need 1 or 2 good seasons in college football to have that factor. I mean, you can go back and look at, obviously there's 4-year guys like Colt Brennan, for example, but you can even look at a guy like Peyton Hillis, for example, going all the way back to him. I mean, he only had like 1 decent season. one really strong season. So you sit there and say to yourself, like, you don't necessarily have to have 4 great seasons of college football for you to say to yourself, okay, I'm ready for the NFL. Now you're staying in college football because you're like, hey, I'm going to get my payday here, and I don't even know if I'm going to make the NFL because only 1% of them do. So now you're kind of looking at it in terms of more of a business opportunity than you are anything else. But that's going to be the big storyline with Texas is one, how patient is Stark going to be with Quinn Ewers, because they have any sort of packages at all for Arch Manning really throughout this playoff. So that part of it intrigued me a little bit. And obviously your second problem is the rushing attack did absolutely nothing. And you have to be a little nervous about that, considering how undersized Arizona State's defensive line is. And big shout out to them for putting up a fight and being determined too. Arizona State gave up some big explosive plays, particularly within the first half and also in that fourth quarter where they had that comeback drive. But at the same time too, you got to be a little bit worried about Texas. But at the same time, the one thing I will always give Texas credit for is that no matter who they play, they always play to the level of their opponent. So I'm not going to sit there and say that Ohio State's going to steamroll them. I'm not going to sit there and say that Texas has no chance. All I'm going to point out is there's a lot more flaws with Texas than there is with Ohio State, because I think everybody would agree with me that Ohio State clearly is the favorite, like they should be. When you're the most talented team in the country, when you've taken care of business versus Oregon, when you whoop Tennessee, why aren't you the favorite? I mean, Chip Kelly, his play calling has been firing on all cylinders. Will Howard has been an absolute beast. Jeremiah Smith has been explosive and being a huge deep threat, which I think is going to pose some problems for Texas. And when you have that two-headed monster of Henderson and Junkins, I don't see how you're going to stop them. And regardless of whether it's Notre Dame or Penn State playing in the finals, I don't see how you don't bet on Ohio State to win the national title here.